Last night I spoke again with President Biden. I appreciate the US's firm stand in the Security Council, a stand that supports our war effort. I told President Biden yesterday that we will fight until a complete victory, however long it takes. The United States understands that. I have seen false publications claiming that the US prevented and is preventing us from operational operations in the region. This is not true. Israel is a sovereign state. Our decisions in the war are based on our operational considerations, and I will not elaborate on that. They are not dictated by external pressures.
We are proud to be the United States' closest partner and friend. Perhaps the greatest challenge Israel and the United States face at this time together is the Iranian nuclear program. Let there be no doubt. Iran does not strive to attain nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. Iran has spread hatred, terror, and suffering throughout the Middle East and beyond, adding fuel to the disastrous fire and suffering in Ukraine. Iran is the only nation on the planet publicly calling, plotting, and developing means to annihilate another nation and members of the family of nations, the State of Israel. Allowing Iran to become a nuclear threshold state, whether by omission or by diplomatic commission, is unacceptable.
I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children.
Babies and toddlers were found with their heads decapitated.
What separates Israel, the United States, and other democracies is our respect for international law.
There's no occupation in Gaza.
Oh, yes, there is. Absolutely. Absolutely, there is.
I don't think there's any way Israel can be expected to coexist or find some diplomatic off-ramp with these savages.
Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. A full-scale Israeli ground offensive would likely lead to large-scale casualties.
They are terrorists. Civilians as human shield.
Accept the right of Israel to exist.
Whoever strikes Israel will strike back.
Does that mean starve the Palestinian people?
They have to be eradicated.
My view is one side is guilty, and it's not Israel.
The war is not just with Hamas. The war is with all the civilians.
We're in a religious war here.
Finish them. Finish them.
There is two sides. One side, the Israeli side, who wish and dream for peace, for optimism, for life, for dignity. And there is one side that cherish death, that cherish destruction, that brings destruction. Fundamentalism, extremist. You need to choose a side.
It is worth noting that MSNBC's Ralph Sanchez offered a rare instance in all this coverage of what reporting on this type of situation actually should look like.
There are instances in the past where the Israeli military has said things in the immediate aftermath of an incident that have turned out not to be true in the long run. And the one example I'll give you is that when the Al Jazeera journalist Shireen Abu Akleh was killed in the occupied West Bank, the Israeli military initially said that she was killed by Palestinian gunmen, and it was only months and months later that they admitted that it was likely an Israeli soldier who fired the fatal shot.
Do you think the U.S., Israel, Egypt needs to be doing more to help these innocent Palestinian civilians get out of harm's way? Although you just heard Jake Sullivan say one of the problems is Hamas is keeping the civilians in Gaza. They don't want them to leave.
Throughout this segment, there is no mention of a ceasefire, which would certainly take civilians out of harm's way. Citing Biden's National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, Tapper also places the onus on Hamas for what's happening in Gaza, not the country that controls Gaza and has been carpet bombing it. Because again, the premise is silently agreed upon. Israel has a right to defend itself. Israel is right to defend itself. But look, it goes well beyond this. Yeah, there's so much more. While people keep referencing this is Israel's 9/11, this is Israel's 9/11, what keeps being missed is that, yeah, it is a lot like 9/11. specifically in the way the US news media and its political establishment, choking on the fog of war, absolutely lost their minds, cultivated one of the worst periods of mass hysterical racism, and gallivanted into two of the bloodiest wars of the past century, leading to complete destabilization of entire regions and millions dead. We have editorials from leading papers calling to stand with Israel against war crimes as it carries out horrific war crimes. We have op-eds by professors calling their students anti-Semitic and imploring employers not to hire them because they stand against the Israeli occupation, against apartheid. We have billionaire CEOs seeking to ruin the lives of students who wrote a letter akin to the Haaretz editorial blaming the Hamas attack on Benjamin Netanyahu. MSNBC removed its 3 Muslim anchors from the anchor chair. Reuters declines to even name Israel in its statements about the killing of one of its journalists, Issam Abdullah.
It should be very clear that Hamas is the one putting Palestinians or those in Gaza at great risk. I mean, they are putting their command and control units inside hospitals, inside areas where there are innocent civilians.
And the United States isn't alone in this cravenous hysteria. Canada, the United Kingdom, France, and Germany have all joined in to give Israel a carte blanche while pushing their anti-Muslim, anti-Arab, and anti-Palestinian rhetoric and policies into overdrive.
We spoke about several demonstrations across Britain during which people voiced their backing for Hamas. We accept that this was poorly phrased and was a misleading description of the pro-Palestinian demonstrations.
But do you condone what Hamas has done over the past 24 hours?
Listen, why is it the job of the occupied to come and condone or condemn or protect the security of its occupier?
And so when a 6-year-old Palestinian American Muslim boy, Wadi al-Fayoum, is stabbed 26 times by his mother's landlord, who was concerned about the non-existent global day of jihad that made headlines across the country, who are we blaming? Are we blaming Hamas? Or are we blaming a media and political landscape that decided that the greatest lesson from the mass hysteria following 9/11 that led to some of the greatest civil and human rights violations in recent history was to repeat it?
In a violation of free speech rights, boycotting Israel could become illegal in the U.S. Proposed legislation in Congress would make it a crime for Americans to boycott Israel, even though that is their constitutionally protected right. For years, Congress has tried to pass laws that would criminalize a boycott of Israel, a top priority for the pro-Israel lobby and major donors to both Democrats and Republicans. These laws would make it illegal for Americans to refuse on political grounds to do business with Israel. They portray the Boycott, Divestment, Sanctions Movement, or BDS, as a form of anti-Semitism.
There's only one word for it: anti-Semitism. Let us call out the BDS movement for what it is.
Well, I'm not aware of instances in history where there's been an effort through federal legislation to attempt to criminalize political boycotts, which are, of course, constitutionally protected activity.
BDS is a movement calling on supporters to withhold business and cultural interactions with Israel as a non-violent form of pressure to demand Palestinian rights. In early 2019, the previously introduced Combating BDS Act failed to advance in Congress. This bill would have given state and local governments the power to boycott any businesses that boycott Israel. It's also being pushed forward by the pro-Israel lobby and would work to legally strengthen already existing anti-BDS laws at the state level. This comes after Congress failed to pass the Israel Anti-Boycott Act as part of a spending bill before the end of its term in 2018.
There's some powerful forces who just want to throw it into the bill and then force it through without fuller reflection from the body.
Faz Shakir of the American Civil Liberties Union says the proposed legislation violates Americans' constitutionally protected freedom of speech. He believes many members of Congress are unaware of the constitutional implications of this legislation. The Israel Anti-Boycott Act proposes prohibiting boycotts against allies of the United States, specifically calling out boycotts against Israel. For the ACLU, that's a huge issue.
It's trying to chill and stifle speech merely because somebody has a viewpoint that they don't like. And once you go down that road, of course, anybody is susceptible to being targeted for politically unpopular speech.
And Yousef Munir of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights says these laws are specifically directed at groups like his.
The basic point of this act, and the supporters of the legislation are on record saying this, is to combat the Palestinian rights movement here in the United States, which has adopted, of course, boycott, divestment, and sanctions tactics.
BDS has already scored some notable successes. Celebrities like Danny Glover and Naomi Klein have publicly called for boycott of Israel.
I support BDS, and I've supported BDS since 2009. The question is, what do you do when a people under illegal occupation come together and chart out a way for the rest of the world to express their solidarity and support them?
Even church groups like Presbyterian Church USA, the United Church of Christ, and others have announced divestment from Israel. Israel's supporters are seeking to shut down the movement as support grows for citizen action like BDS. Today, 26 states have passed anti-BDS laws, with 13 additional states considering similar measures as well. But in two separate court cases, federal judges in Kansas and Arizona ruled that state laws punishing individuals or companies for partaking in BDS were unconstitutional and violated free speech rights. Meanwhile, the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act would force the U.S. Department of Education to treat criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic harassment. In other words, a violation of the Civil Rights Act.
The problem of legislating on it is you're casting too wide a net and you're suggesting activity is anti-Semitic that really isn't anti-Semitism. It's merely a difference of a point of view on a policy area.
This would effectively stifle the speech of Palestinian rights advocacy groups like Munir's organization, and ironically would use anti-Semitism as grounds to silence even Jewish critics of Israel, like Jewish Voice for Peace and If Not Now. Here's Jewish academic Judith Butler of Jewish Voice for Peace on BDS.
Support for boycott, divestment, and sanctions is just, that it is a support for a social justice movement, and that it does not imply anti-Semitism.
But I think because, the state of Israel has also gone to great lengths to conflate Judaism and Zionism, there is an understanding in our discourse that somehow these things are more tied than they are in reality.
The First Amendment prevents Congress from making laws that limit free speech. And the ACLU has publicly criticized these pieces of legislation for undermining constitutional values.
The legal fight is, of course, over whether you can impose a criminal fine or a civil fine merely because somebody has a viewpoint that you don't like. And the answer on that is obviously you cannot.
So what happens if these pieces of legislation are passed and become law? Let's start with the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. This law is actually an amendment of the 1979 Export Administration Act, which prohibited U.S. citizens and companies from boycotting friendly nations. U.S. citizens would also be unable to request any information about companies that conduct business relations with Israel, and wouldn't even be allowed to notify the UN if it's unknowingly doing business with Israel.
So the legal consequences are broad. It could be really anything. The things that I fear here is that a federal government passes Anti-Israel Boycott Act, and what may happen is that federal prosecutors throughout America now have new tools at their disposal to target protesters on this issue.
Under this proposed law, both individuals and companies could face financial penalties for supporting EU or UN-backed boycotts of Israel, Israeli companies, and specifically those in the occupied West Bank.
The point here is to intimidate rights activists for engaging in constitutionally protected activity by threatening them with the specter of criminalization and steep fines.
Violations of the law could see U.S. citizens paying up to $250,000 in civil penalties. Willful violations of the law could see citizens fined up to $1 million. And then there's the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which the ACLU and other activist organizations have issued statements opposing.
This is legislation that would actually call on the Department of Education to adopt a particular definition of anti-Semitism or a particular understanding of anti-Semitism, which it should take into consideration as it looks at civil rights discrimination complaints.
This bill would work to silence critics and criticism of Israel in schools, colleges, and universities. And institutions of learning would also work to ensure that their campuses are spaces where criticism of Israel cannot occur, violating their free speech rights to avoid investigations by the Department of Education.
So a student protester who's on a listserv having a debate about Palestinian issues could easily be castigated for having engaged in anti-Semitism and then fear the wrath of a federal agency.
This could result in numerous lawsuits and court cases in which activists and educational institutions sue the government for violations of their free speech and civil rights.
And so what gets unleashed here is potentially prosecutors who use this power in very unfortunate ways. But the other ramification, as you well know, is that culturally it suggests something to all Americans about what will not be tolerated. And that is, of course, this chilling of speech that we worry gravely about.
But despite the possibility of these pieces of legislation becoming law, 2 U.S. Congresswomen have stated their support for BDS. Ilhan Omar of Minnesota and Rashida Tlaib of Michigan have come out in support of BDS. Tlaib is saying she'll lead a congressional delegation to the occupied West Bank in 2019, and that would be a first. Menayer says this is a sign of changing times.
When you look at public opinion, seeing a shift on this issue as well, and primarily the Republican base of white evangelicals being hyper supportive of Israel. In the base of the Democratic Party in particular, millennials and people of color being much, much more critical of Israeli policy and supportive of the rights of Palestinians.
But Menayer is still concerned about the legislation potentially being passed and what that will mean for free speech and organizing around Palestine.
For vulnerable communities, including people who are working on Palestinian rights work, they have even more reason to be concerned about the way in which this would be enforced, very much for the purpose of intimidating them and marginalizing them.
Vengeance is not a foreign policy doctrine. We are here to save lives. Israelis, Palestinians, Americans. Anyone else?
So is that a yes or a no?
Anyone else?
I do have another question. Why don't you want Israelis to go after the terrorists that burned, tortured, killed their babies and children and still have them hostage? Why don't you want the Israelis to go after the terrorists that did that?
How many more killings is enough for you? Is it 1,000 more? 2,000 more? 3,000 more? How many more Palestinians would make you happy if they died? Will you be fine if all of the people of Gaza were gone? Would that make you happy? Would that be the thing that makes you proud? And maybe that's the question you should ask Richie. Is he okay? How many more Palestinian lives is he comfortable with? Because I am not comfortable with any more.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit about the Jewish lobby in the US and the role that they play in the injustices that are happening in Israel at the moment, and in particular what you kind of think their motives are. I mean, are they part of War Inc., or are they very kind of culturally, kind of religiously kind of motivated?
Yeah, these are great. I'm so happy to be at Oxford. They're the best conversations ever, and usually over a glass of something alcoholic too, which is, higher education at its best. So there's some great books about the Israel lobby. And I definitely would say they're not religious, that overwhelmingly, I think that a lot of geopolitical interests are using religion, and this happens on the Muslim side too, and we could have evenings devoted to it, are using religion and manipulating people who have very little power with religion, but that the real interests are money and transcend nations. That basically what's happening right now in the world is ordinary people are beginning to realize through the internet that there are no enemies. right? That everyone pretty much wants to live in peace and protect the planet, right? Especially your generation. I think it's harder to sell you guys the idea that, you know, someone's totally alien to you. And then that's a threat to War Inc., which is one of the biggest concentrations of wealth and power on the planet, and like 6 other industries that run everything, and that these interests now are global and they transcend nation states, and so increasingly they're more powerful than parliaments and congresses now. And AIPAC is an example of this. There are other examples that are not Israeli, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership and, you know, big oil, right? But what AIPAC does is it definitely silences reporting that's balanced on this kind of thing. It definitely funds, this has been well established, gives early seed money to candidates so that by the time people are elected, they really can't deviate from a support for Israel, whatever Israel is up to party line, or else they won't have the money to get reelected. Basically, AIPAC, look, I couldn't draw you a Venn diagram, but basically AIPAC and a number of other entities really profit, you know, Raytheon, I mean, you know, any number of entities that primarily are funded by war, contractors in Washington, D.C. with big houses, you know, like I hear from my sources in the intelligence world that we have to keep going with ISIS and with, you know, drumming up War Inc. forever, and the sound bites you're getting now in Britain that this will be years and years and years of conflict. You could know at the beginning of World War II that it would be years and years and years of conflict. History doesn't work that way. But if you're War Inc., you have to prime populations, especially democracies, for years and years and years of conflict, because that's where the vast profits are generated. So basically, there's a huge movement of young Muslims who are sophisticated, young Jews who are sophisticated, people all over the world who are just sick of this and ready to just kind of create a civil society. But they don't own the media, they don't own the politicians, and so AIPAC and other interests are, and also Kuwait and, you know, Saudi Arabia are obstacles because there's profit to be made in keeping us hating each other.